definitely not what you would call sporty, but I freaking love the Olympics for three main reasons. One, because I am absolutely the kind of person who tears up watching a profile of an athlete who came back from retirement after nearly dying. Two, way too many viewings of Cool Runnings as a child. And three, because the Olympics aren't just a sporting event. They're one of the biggest branding exercises on Earth. Every 2 years, a city gets handed the ultimate design brief. Convince the entire planet that you are vibrant and modern and culturally rich and welcoming and, worth visiting as a tourist. But also, please design everything. Logos and packaging and signage and merch and wayfinding and uniform and motion graphics and stadium graphics and typography systems the size of a small novel. And somehow, through all of that designed stuff, some Olympic brands become burned into our collective consciousness forever. And other ones seem to completely disappear from memory even while they're still going on. Why is that? So I had to ask the completely normal, totally well-adjusted question, what actually makes a good Olympic brand? And maybe more importantly, which one was the best? This question sent me down a deeply unhinged research spiral. I've seen some people talk about Olympic logos, and I heard a lot of talk about whether or not the Paris logo should have had lips on it, but I haven't seen anyone actually look at the brands as a whole enough to actually answer that question. So I spent 2 weeks pouring through the Olympic Museum website and Reddit and Wikipedia and screenshotting every random piece of merch I could find so that we could look at not just the logos, but the fullest look possible at how each brand actually presented itself through the game. So we could actually answer that question. I tried to make this a reasonable length video, but I failed. So I just decided I'm gonna make the rambly, nerdy-ass video that I would want to watch. There will be drama, there will be controversy, there will be plagiarism allegations, and questionable public design contests, and some hot takes. This is Design in the Wild, and today we are ranking every Olympic brand in history. Let's go. Before we get into the rankings, though, let's set some ground rules, because this is not just about whether I personally like a logo or not. The Olympics are a global cultural moment, and they have to do three very specific things. Number one, does it represent the city? Does this branding actually feel like this place? It doesn't need to be super literal and have a bunch of city landmarks, but it does need to represent the culture and the heritage and the vibe of a place. If you removed the name and date, would it still feel like that place, or could it be for any game? Number two, is it a full system? The best brand systems have elements that can be extrapolated to all kinds of different things to tell one cohesive story. It doesn't have to be the most intricate thing in the world, but this is a huge event and it has a lot of application needs and a lot of different people working on it. Each game gets a huge brand guidelines Bible made years ahead of time. But even with all of that information, some years have just copy and pasted the primary logo and maybe a mascot and just slapped it on every single application. So beyond just having a good mark, we have to ask how well the brand can expand and show up in a lot of different places to create a really full, immersive experience where everything feels like you're at the same party. And number three, is it memorable? This is the big one. Does it stick in your brain? Make you feel something? Spark nostalgia? Bring you back to that year instantly? Because some of these brands are 40 or 50 or 60 years old and they still feel alive somehow. And that's design doing its job. So with all of that in mind, A tier is gold medal branding. These understood the assignment. They're memorable and scalable. And even if it wasn't your personal taste, they created a complete, iconic identity that carried the whole event. B tier. They got the job done. Solid systems with a clear sense of place. They might not have been the most revolutionary, but they were effective and professional and cohesive. C tier, a time capsule. These were definitely a brand, but looking back, they feel a little dated or chaotic or just very much a product of their era. And D tier, what brand? If I had to re-Google it to remind myself what it looked like while I was actively researching this video, you failed the assignment. I would rather have a crazy, hot mess of a brand that I can still vividly remember 15 years later than one that I can barely recall at all. All right, so with that, let's open the vault. Okay, so the Olympic International Committee was founded in 1896 by this guy, Baron Pierre de Coubertin. And for the first few years of the Games, there was no brand at all. There was just a poster announcing the event. At the St. Louis World's Fair, they didn't even have a poster. They were just there. And then in 1913, our friend Pierre decided that they needed an icon for the Games themselves. And this is the part that blew my mind. He just drew out the original Olympic Rings logo himself. Which is kind of badass. He wanted it to represent all 5 continents, and he chose the colors to be every color that at the time was in every country's flag. So it would represent unity and connection through sport, which is kind of a cool idea. And honestly, I'm pretty shocked at how fantastic these rings are as a mark that was made in 1913. They made their first appearance in the Antwerp Games in 1920, and they've barely been touched since, which in the world of branding is pretty much unheard of. So we got ourselves a logo. But for the next few decades, each individual game didn't really have its own brand, beyond a couple of posters and maybe an occasional emblem. Special shout out for the emblem for the Rome games, because I can't even describe. Wow. Some of these posters are actually pretty rad, and maybe someday we could do an Olympic poster ranking if you want. But for now, we really don't see anything that resembles a real brand until Tokyo 1964. It is amazing how much of a designer cult following this brand still has, and I completely get it. It obviously doesn't have all of the full brand extensions that you would see in a modern game now, but it is head and shoulders different than anything we had seen before, as opposed to just a few different posters that felt totally different from each other and made by totally different people. This felt like it had one cohesive, clear vision made by one team. The logo itself is obviously pretty simple. It's the rising sun from the Japanese flag with a really nice clean lockup, but the whole thing feels really striking and clear. And beyond just one logo, they created a whole color palette and suite that went across a lot of different elements and applications throughout the whole city. It was also the creation of what we would consider the modern pictogram. Olympic Games had a really specific challenge in that you had all of these countries coming together with all of these tourists that spoke very different languages, and you needed to have all of the explanations and signage and wayfinding in a ton of different languages. Previous games had done illustrations of different sporting events, but the Japanese team took this a lot more seriously and created a really minimalistic, very graphic portrayal of not just each individual event, but also how to get around the city and maneuver. They even created the first version of toilet signage that we now kind of assume is ubiquitous. And you see these pictograms used across all of the game. And that was pretty revolutionary. It's pretty amazing how well this has held up as a brand. It's very mid-century, but it's just strong and lovely, and I think it would look good right now. Which means no question, this is going straight up to gold medal branding, setting us off on a really strong trajectory to kick off our branding journey. We're setting a really high standard for what good branding could look like. As a spoiler, it doesn't always turn out that way. Okay, so next we're in Grenoble, France. And after the branding victory of the full complete picture that Tokyo presented, this is just kind of some posters, and they didn't really pick up on the idea of creating a more cohesive full look. I think the logo itself is actually pretty cool. This is a graphic interpretation of the coat of arms of the city, which I think is neat. I actually think this looks cool. But since we are not just grading logos, we have to look at what else they did with it. There really wasn't a lot of branding or wayfinding or signage to speak of. There were some individual posters that looked they were made by completely different people, totally different type treatments, totally different colors. So there's just not what I would consider a brand. Now, since you probably can't take your eyes off of it either, you will notice the very first character of an Olympic game. Not an official mascot, but this is Shoes. I'm not entirely sure what he is, but I think he's on a ski, and he will absolutely be haunting my dreams. I couldn't find a lot of specific explanation about what exactly happened, or how they made him, or why, or what it is exactly, but, you know, here we go. And definitely a glimpse into the future of some pretty terrifying mascots to come. Overall, it's early days, they get a pass, they made a weird mascot guy, but there really is no brand to speak of, so it's going right down to D tier. And then we're going to swing right back up into the stars for Mexico 68. Guys, this brand has a chokehold on my brain. I am obsessed with it. I would like to live at this Olympic Games. I love everything about it. This was a collaboration between 3 different designers, and it was meant to reference the graphic patterns that are used a lot by the Huichol people in the Jalisco region of Mexico. I just think it's a really clever solution, taking the 5 rings and expanding them out to create this sort of psychedelic repeat pattern that extends out not just in these round shapes, but then follows down all of the lines of the word to create this woven texture. It feels very representative of the time. Obviously, it has a very psychedelic kind of hippie sort of vibe, but it's also very connected to the place, but in a really modern way. And what I love about it is that it can be used endlessly. And they did. They didn't just make wayfinding and signage. They extended this to packaging and patterns. I mean, look at these dresses that these women are wearing. I would wear this in a second. They made giant signage that people could climb on and hang out in. They made stamps and packaging and merch. And it's just really easy to see how this one idea can be extended out into an endless amount of things. If you gave me this design right now, I could keep making new merch for this event. And that's what a great design can do. They created a pretty wild extended color palette. They added in some different elements like block printing and texturing. I also love this pictogram system that they created that reference the hieroglyphics that are seen throughout Mayan culture. It makes sense for the place, but it's also really usable as actual wayfinding and signage. Look at these giant pillars and things in the stands that they were able to use. It's not just informational, it's also just really graphic and cool. They started using it as a design element in addition to it being helpful as you're guiding people through. It's also the first games that created a series of posters to represent each of the individual events and really promote all of the different sports. That's something you're going to see through a lot of my favorite designs in the future, and it's something I think really extends the life of a whole brand here. I don't know why every game hasn't made their own version of these posters for every sport, but the ones that do really continue to build out the brand in ways that can be really useful. And this is the first version of it, which I think is really cool. Overall, it's expressive, it's memorable, it references the specific place, but it feels like something that could be current right now. I just love this brand. So we're riding high, we think, okay, we've cracked this whole Olympic branding thing, now we go into the Sapporo Games. And mind you, Tokyo had not that long ago already killed this whole idea of an extended brand, which is why I was a little shocked to see how little there was in these 1972 games. Again, we're right back to, here are some posters, and that's pretty much it. On the actual logo mark front, it's fine. Obviously, we have the rising sun for the Japanese flag. This specific snowflake design is actually an ancient symbol that is used to represent the first fall of snow, which is pretty neat. But overall, the spacing is really weird. I don't get this really tight blocking. It also hits the first of my Olympic design pet peeves that we're going to run into today, which is logos with a really defined back color. So you have this white blocking instead of it being transparent, which means everything you put it on has this really weird blockout. It just doesn't lay on top of things, and so it really limits how far you can use this logo and where you can put it. Remember that, because we're going to see this a lot more later. These posters are pretty striking and they have a cool vibe to them, but there's just not a lot going on. So we're going to go down to, where's the brand? So then we come to Munich 1972. Now, as a disclaimer, I'm not going to get into any political or historical things that happened in the games themselves. I'm just going to talk about the design of each game and kind of what they were trying to do. But this design team had a real challenge on their hands. The last time that Germany had hosted the games was in 1932. So, there's that. And obviously that wasn't a great connotation. So now that they have the chance to host the games again in the 70s, this is not just about how to represent the Olympics. They're kind of reintroducing themselves to the international community through these games. They need to show that they are friendly and warm and welcoming and, open for tourism business. And they went for it. So allegedly they received 2,332 entries for a design for this game, and every one of them was deemed unsatisfactory. So they tapped the designer that was going to be in charge of the games to come up with a logo and create the whole cohesive look. They didn't just want a mark, they wanted a full brand system, which, I can get behind. The logo itself is supposed to represent spiraling rays of light to be like the light of the games themselves. And overall, the spacing is pretty weird. There's this very strange orientation, but I'm kind of into it. And also this typeface's universe, which is just an iconic and long-lasting type for a reason. I think it holds up great here. And it's a really interesting overall layout. On its own, it's kind of odd, but when you see it laid on top of posters and graphics, it kind of incorporates into whatever it's laid on in a really interesting way. Because they didn't put it in a white box like the Sapporo games, you're able to see it interact with whatever it's laid on top of, in a way that I really like. I don't think I've ever made a logo with the mark on the bottom, but I'm kind of into it here in a weird way. And they didn't just make a logo, they made a really complete system. They made a really extensive brand guidelines for one of the first times, a very complete color palette in this very kind of warm, very 70s tone, which I kind of like. And they really focused on creating a really strong set of pictograms that could be used not just to represent the individual sports, but also as like a brand pattern that could go in a lot of places. They made a really stylized set of posters posters for each of the events, and a lot of signage and different promotional pieces that could then be used in a bunch of different stuff. And they didn't just stop there. They made a lot of merchandise and packaging and stamps and commemorative things. They made tote bags and t-shirts. They handed out matchbooks for free. Anything to kind of get this brand out there, not just to represent the Olympic Games, but kind of the city as a whole. They really saw it as a marketing machine for the first time. And speaking of firsts, you probably noticed this little guy, which was the first official mascot. Going back to the question, how do we make a warm, friendly Germany? The answer was, make an adorable little dachshund mascot. Meet Waldi. He was actually based off of the designer's real dog, and they made him a full character. There were toys and cartoons and drawings and giant things that you could take home and stuffed animals that people still have versions of now. It became beloved in the city, and I think it's a really cool idea of how you can personify the games in a way that makes it not just about the sport. He became such a hit that the idea of a mascot was sort of a no-brainer from there on out. And for better or worse, we will see mascots at every game moving forward. So thanks, Valdi, for the treats that await us. Overall, this is expressive and cohesive. It connects to what Germany was trying to represent for itself, and you can see how you could take this exact set of rules and make anything you needed to. If you asked me to make a trash can in this design style, I could make one for you, no problem. And that's a good brand. So then we jump to Innsbruck, 76, and we're right back to here's some posters and some snow, I guess? This logo is actually a repeat of the logo that Innsbruck used the last time it hosted the games. It's actually a cool mark. It's a representation of the coat of arms of the city. But again, it's a full repeat from the last time. Come on, guys. Each individual poster is completely different, totally different type treatments. There's no consistency whatsoever. They did introduce this slightly terrifying snowman, which shockingly is not actually as creepy as a lot of the ones we're going to see in the future. But his name is Schneemendel, which I think is literally snowman in English. So, here he is, I guess. This also brings us to my Olympic design pet peeve number 2. Winter Olympics brand theme is cold. We're going to see a lot of generic snowflakes and just like general, hey, it's winter branding, which is just, not my favorite, but here it is. And then we move to Montreal 76. Overall, this is very 70s, but I kind of dig it. And it definitely has a clear aesthetic. It's a strong color palette. It's very Olympic. But it also has some sense of the place in a very mid-century, reduced, minimal kind of way. The mark itself is kind of great. It feels like it was made by Paul Rand. It's very clean. It's very scalable. Kind of feels like it could be made today. It's pretty abstract, but I like that it represents the rings, but also kind of feels like an M for Montreal and vaguely a maple leaf, which we will definitely see in a lot of Canadian brands coming up. Spoiler. But I think it's a cool mark. I like how it can be used in a lot of different ways, and I like how it lays over other things. This very minimalist beaver's name is Amik, which means beaver in Algonquin. And I love the idea of this poor minimalist designer being told by the committee, no, we have to have a mascot. Look how well Valdi did. You have to give us a mascot. So he's like, fine, I will make the most streamlined, stripped down idea of a beaver humanly possible. It's definitely not like what I would call a mascot, and seeing like the live version of it that they have to hold is absolutely hilarious. This thing that they're writing is so funny, but it's kind of cool in a weird kind of subversive way, and I don't hate it. Overall, they got the job done. Now we're on to Lake Placid 1980, and we're back to, hey look, it's cold here as a brand. The logo itself is just a lot. It is the first entry in a series I like to call we have to literally name the full game in the logo with every word possible series. And this poor designer who was told they have to fit all of these words into this mark. They did the best they could. The lines are supposed to represent the mountains around Lake Placid and something to do with representing the history of the previous games and holding up the torch of the rings. I don't know, it's a lot. When you start looking at extended branding, again, we have every single poster was made by a different person with totally different typefaces and no consistency problem. I do actually really like this series of posters they made for the sports. This like psychedelic risograph printing is actually really modern looking. I think could get made now. I feel like that's about the best I can say. This little handsome devil is named Ronnie the Raccoon, and he's a raccoon. His lifeless little beady eyes are, something, and the walk-around versions of this costume are kind of terrifying. But, he's cute, I guess. Overall, just, what brand? And then we take a hard left into the Moscow 80 games. And this is a really different vibe. The mark itself is, super Soviet. I think this is supposed to represent the running track going into the Soviet building. And it's, intense. But as a mark, it's pretty graphic. It's pretty scalable. It can be used a lot of places. I don't hate it. It is what it is. The real standout for this games was Misha the bear. Valdi walked so that Misha could run. They put out an open call on television programs and in newspapers for people to write in what kind of animal they wanted to be the mascot, and they got 450,000 letters in response, and most requested a bear. They had 60 different versions of bear graphics made by designers and illustrators and artists, and they chose Misha, who was designed by a really beloved Russian children's book author. I think that was a really smart choice, because instead of being this really graphic, modernist take, having this really friendly, charming, illustrated, mischievous little bear just was a totally different vibe than everything that had been done since then, and even just the rest of the graphics of the games. Misha became beloved by the country. There were cartoons that had 100 episodes made. There were costumes and merch and teddy bears, and he just completely proliferated the whole country. There's a very famous moment of lore from the actual games themselves, where in the closing ceremonies, they had the whole stands holding up pictures of Misha's face while a single tear rolled down his cheek because he was sad the games were ending. Even after the games, Misha continued to be the representation of Russian culture. They even shot him into space and sent him to the space station. And that is the power of an actually good mascot. He definitely outshines the rest of what was happening here, but overall, it's a strong brand, it did the job, good job. And now we get to Sarajevo 1984. This hits the same, hey look, it's winter, let's make a snowflake thing, but I actually don't hate it. I think it's actually a really cool version of that. I like the mark. I think it has a weird vibe to it. This orange color palette is a really unique choice, and it definitely has character. This is an interesting one for me because it represents a country that no longer really exists in this form. So the question of, does it represent the place? I mean, it has a really strong vibe, and yet a lot of this feels pretty modern and could kind of consist now. I actually love this really expressive poster series with these really gestural, painterly versions of all of the sports. That's a totally different style than anything we've seen in the past or anything we're going to see in any future games. And I think it's a really cool version. I feel like these posters could be collector's items I would put up on my wall, which I think is neat. And obviously, after the runaway success of Misha the Bear, they wanted to do the same thing. They opened up a contest and asked people to submit ideas, and they selected Vulko the Wolf, who I actually think is kind of great. As opposed to Misha, this charming, cute little buddy you want to cuddle, this guy's a little bit mischievous, but I kind of like him. He's super expressive, he's not creepy, and I think it has a real vibe to him. I also love these versions where it's in this really painterly style again. I think it's really unique and kind of a clever version of showing a mascot. I love how integrated he is to a lot of this branding, and you see him show up in ways that aren't just hey look, this mascot is for kids, but he's really representing the brand in ways that I think are pretty nice. Overall, I kind of feel like this is a real vibe. They did the job. And if anyone has found any of those posters, I would love to buy one. I think it's very cool. And now we come to a real party in the USA in LA 84. This is obviously a massive vibe difference. And you know what? It really does the thing. It's bright, it's colorful, it's very Memphis design of the 80s. And if you're anything like me, the first thing you think is, man, this feels like Disney World. And I don't think that's accidental. These games took place in LA, just a couple of miles away from Anaheim, California, where Disneyland was. And I think they took a lot of inspiration from that vibe. Especially when you get into a lot of the signage and environmental graphics of the games themselves and the Olympic Village, it feels like you are on the It's a Small World ride, which, as a beloved disciple of Mary Blair, I am not mad at, but it is a definite mood. The thing that I feel like is taking it down a notch is the actual mark itself. The whole color palette of the game is this bright, vibrant, pastel, very Memphis design thing, which is definitely a mood. But if I showed you all of this stuff and then the actual mark, they just do not seem together at all. First off, I don't know why we have to cram the entire official lengthy title of the games. Something about the Roman numerals with an erd next to it just gives me the heebie-jeebies, and that is just a rough scaling that I just don't understand. Obviously, the idea was red, white, and blue, star-spangled. There are 13 stripes in this star, just like in the flag. I get that it's very all-American. It just doesn't seem to have anything to do with what LA was trying to do for the games. It's also just really busy. It gets a little bit better when you translate the color palette into the rest of the color palette of the game, but even so, it just feels totally out of place. Something more like this blocky LA84 would have made a much better fit for the rest of what they were trying to do. And then we come to Sam the Eagle, seems kind of inevitable. Ironically, the actual first choice was to do a bear because it represented the state animal of California, but that was shot down because, Misha had just happened. So they fell back to the good old-fashioned American eagle. Now, if he looks a little familiar to you, maybe a little Disney-like, that is because he was made by Robert Moore, who is a long-term Disney illustrator and head of marketing for a really long time. So it feels very California because, it feels like a Disney character. Overall, this is a whole mood, and it definitely is a brand and fits a vibe, but I would say it very strongly is a time capsule of a thing that kind of is a bit of a chaotic mess. I would love to see it, refine a little bit more, but, it's a lot of fun. Looking ahead to what they've already been working on for the LA Games in 28, they're definitely referencing a lot of these things in the new branding, which I think is really kind of fun. It'll be fun to see how a more modern interpretation of all of this vibe happens now. Now we head to Calgary 88. Before I dove into all of this research, the only thing I knew about the Calgary Games was that is where 4 plucky Jamaicans stole all of our collective heartstrings. And after looking at all of this research, that's kind of still the only thing I have from the Calgary Games. There's just not much going on here. The mark itself is kind of, it's supposed to be a mashup of a maple leaf and a snowflake and the seas for Calgary and Canada. Overall, it gets a cool shape. We're back to just, hey, look, it's cold as the branding for the Winter Olympics. There's not really even a cohesive color palette exactly. It's just kind of whatever. This slightly terrifying couple are brother and sister polar bears named Heidi and Howdy. It's the first time you get 2 mascots, so that's, an accomplishment. We're seeing a female mascot for the first time, so, yay. Overall, they're fine. It's fine. It's fine. And then we jump to Seoul, and I think this one has so much character. The logo itself is a traditional mark called a semtaidak. Apologies. And it's a representation of Korea itself. It's used a lot throughout the country as a decorative element in architecture and design and crafts, and I think it makes such a smart idea for a logo that represents both the country and also kind of feels like the coming together of Olympic rings. It feels like the track in the track and field events. It just happens to feel very connected to the games, even though it's this very traditional piece of the culture of the representative city, which I love. The only thing that bugs me about the mark is I don't know why they crammed the rings right on top. Just give a little bit of breathing room. But other than that, perfect. Lovely. And the overall vibe is definitely of the time, but it's really cool. This is the first time they were using computer-generated graphics to make posters, which, shows, but I think a lot of these are still pretty neat. And I actually love these photo-heavy versions of posters for all of the events. They're just photography, but they're really stylized and they feel really in motion and evocative of the actual events. I think they're really cool. There's a clear system and some elements that can be used in different ways, even though there's not a lot of graphics that are being repeated. Overall, it feels like one thing. This handsome little devil is named Hodori, and I love him. He was again chosen by a public contest. He's wearing a traditional hat called the sangmo, and I love the way the ribbon of it moves around as he plays all of these different sports. I just think he is so expressive. He has so much character. I love how instead of it being a mascot for the little kids, they really used him as part of the whole design. They put him on signage and in packaging, they made stamps, and they had all of his little poses doing each of the events as part of the actual design of the stadiums themselves, which I think is great. Even though it's maybe not as full-reaching as some of the other brands we're going to see in the future, I just think this one has a lot of character, and it really feels like the place, which I love. So it's going straight up to 80. And then we head to Albertville, France, which is, again, fine. This is the first entry of my third Olympic design pet peeve, which is energy swashes as the main design feature. we don't really know what else to do, so we're just going to have a lot of lines, and that's going to represent, sport. These posters are just so 90s. I cannot handle this type treatment. And really none of the things feel consistent. The branding and typography on each of the different treatments is totally different. The mark itself is, fine. Someone was having a lot of fun with early design computer programs. It's supposed to represent, the Olympic flame and skis, and the lines in the back are supposed to be modernity. Sure. The type treatment is completely different than anything else we have going on. And then we have this little guy whose name is Magique. He is a magic star. And, he's got some expression and character, and he's kind of fun. That's about all I can say. Overall, it's fine. It also wins the award for most intense torch ever. If this doesn't look like an alien egg or, something else, I don't know what does. We're just going to leave that one right there. So let's head across the Mediterranean to Barcelona 92. This has the distinction of being one of the first games that I vividly remember as a kid, because I am just that old. And, it is a real party. The mark itself is just the most 90s thing I've ever seen. It would be really fun to redo this one and see if you could make a more modern interpretation of this idea. The blue is supposed to be the Mediterranean, and the yellow is the heat of the sun, and the red is for the love of Spain. It's supposed to be this gestural figure, dancing or gymnasticking. The drop shadow here is just so intense with the rough edge. I mean, you gotta give them a pass, but wow, is this a real moment in time? What I love is that they made this very intensive system for really expanding the reach of how a lot of these graphics could be used. They created this scattered mosaic pattern, which is meant to represent a lot of the Gaudi architecture that you see in Barcelona, which I think it totally works. I have been to these buildings and I instantly recognize that that's what they were doing. And I think it opens up a lot of doors to use that kind of pattern in a lot of different ways, which I think is cool. They made super expressive pictograms, which got used on a lot of things, and they did a series of posters designed by a whole bunch of different artists. So you have obviously very different vibes, but everything feels very in the same universe, which kind of works. This bizarre little fellow is Kobe, who is a Cubist interpretation of a Pyrenean mountain dog. Wow, what a choice. I gotta say though, not as creepy as some of the ones we're gonna see in the future, and he's got a lot of expression to him. I love the way that he tries all these different sports and looks like he's struggling through a lot of them, and they really had a lot of fun with him. They did a lot of co-branding and merch. They made a cartoon. This is also the first time that they did a separate mascot for the Paralympic Games, which is cool. And they put them together and made them friends that have a little troupe, which I think is really sweet. And overall, he's super weird, but I kind of love him. We also have to talk about this poster campaign because holy Photoshop 1.0. This is possibly the most surreal, bizarre interpretation of the sports poster concept that I have seen, and I weirdly kind of love it. This is so beyond anything I could have come up with, and some of these are kind of hysterical and weirdly awesome. I mean, just look at this kid ping-ponging on the globe. What the hell? Overall, it's weird, it's a ton of fun, it's super memorable, but it's very much a time capsule of the beauty that was the 1990s. Now we head to Lillehammer, Norway, and we keep that 90s train going. First off, we gotta talk about this logo. What in the Windows 95 is going on? This Sony Pictures-esque graphic is meant to represent the Aurora Borealis with snow coming into it, and it's set in Times New Roman, which is just a really interesting choice, and I just can't get over it. It also is a perfect example of my pet peeve number one, because every time that it's used, it's set in this white box in a really intense way that just makes it not able to interact with anything it's laid on top of. The thing that frustrates me about this brand is there are pieces of it that I actually really like. For a mascot, instead of picking an animal that represents the place, or, a Cubist mountain dog, they actually decided to use people. They made a little girl and a little boy meant to represent Norwegian spirit, and I kind of love them. And specifically, I love the styling of these characters. I love their clothing. I like their color palette, and I love the way that they're using these bits of traditional patterning on their clothes. And I wish they had taken those elements and expanded them out to the rest of the brand. Instead of this super pixelated snow motif that they used as a graphic, I wish they had taken the graphic that was on the trims of their clothing. This one feels like it was made by two completely different design teams, and then at the end they met and had to smush them together. These illustrations are expressive and whimsical and joyous. I love this illustration style and the block printing style that they use for a lot of these posters. They're using the same super wacky bright color palette, but everything feels a lot more connected to the place. It makes sense instead of this really computer-generated programmed thing. Instead of making costumes for the mascots to walk around in creepily, they actually chose 10 pairs of boys and girls from each of the 10 provinces of Norway to represent them at the games, which I think is awesome. It is significantly hindered by the horrific logo plastered on their costumes. Look how bad that looks with the rest of this really cool vibe. I get that this is very much a victim of its time, but I think you can see how close they were to a really good, kind of timeless design. Ugh. Next, we head to Atlanta, and the weird times just keep on rolling. We are smack dab in the 90s, and boy does it show. First, we gotta talk about this mark, because I feel like it is so close to being really awesome. This was the 100th anniversary of the games, and I love the idea of taking this 100, combining it with the rings, and making it this Corinthian column. That is such a clever idea. But the combo of it laid out with this weirdly horizontal Atlanta 96 just makes this very strange shape that I feel like could be so much tighter. I love the idea of the flames going into the stars, but the registration of these is super weird. I don't know why we have this weird gap. I don't know why they don't fit together better. It's just so close to being a really good idea, and everything about it just feels slightly off. It was also mostly shown with this really deep forest green behind it, so the contrast was really low, and it made it really hard to read. Overall, I feel like they were really trying to make a visual motif that they could use in a lot of ways. And I don't know that it was totally successful, but I appreciate that they were really trying to make a lot of different elements. They took this quilting pattern and then extrapolated that out in a lot of different things, which, is a choice, and I think it's kind of cool. And I appreciate how much it translates into a lot of environmental signage that you're going to see in a television screen when you're watching a race or seeing an event. I think that that's where most people are going to see these graphics, and so you have to think about how whatever you're going to make is going to translate to these big giant banners and posters and flags. And at least they did that. This poster series is just, man, what a time capsule. I don't even know where to begin with these, but this type treatment is just something else. And obviously we have to talk about possibly the second most terrifying mascot of all time. This is Izzy, the What's-It. It was meant to represent technology, and I don't know if you were around in the 90s, but there was a big public backlash to this mascot. He's got a lot of personality. Overall, this is just such a product of its time. It goes squarely into a time capsule. God bless the 90s. And then we get to Nagano, which is a slightly more refined version of that 90s aesthetic. The mark itself is supposed to represent a mountain flower, and each of the petals is a very stylized interpretation of a different winter sport, which I actually think is a really cool idea. I think a modern version of this would be a little bit more simplified. I think you can get rid of the gray altogether. I think each one could be a little bit cleaner and more minimal. It'd be fun to see a modern version of this logo, honestly. But overall, I think it's pretty neat. They also took the idea of this stylized version of each of the poses and then made it into this scattered pattern that becomes this really abstract pattern that they use for a lot of different things. They even represented it in the actual Olympic cauldron itself, which I think is really visually beautiful. And I think translating that pattern of these mashup of bodies into all of these graphics that you see in the overall games is actually really cool. I like how the flower mark can kind of become more of a brand element itself instead of just the logo. And overall, I quite like it. These sport posters are extremely expressive, and I think these paintings are kind of beautiful and really vibrant. These little guys are the snowlets, and on first glance, they're kind of terrifying, but weirdly kind of charming. The longer I spent putting this board together, the more I kind of fell in love with them. I love these weird illustrations of them doing the different sports, and they're kind of adorable in this super weird way. They remind me of the ugly doll craze that would come years later, and they have a lot of character. I kind of love them. Look at their terrified little eyes on a bobsled. Come on. Overall, I didn't originally think that I liked this brand, but the more time I spent with it and the more care I saw in what they did in different expressions made me feel like, you know what? They did the job. So I'm putting it into solid B tier. Now we head to Sydney and hello Millennium. The mark itself is obviously very of its time, but there's some elements here that I actually think are very cool. The figure has a boomerang as the legs, and they use that shape again in all of the pictograms of all of the different sports, which I think is actually really kind of clever. And the smoke of the torch that the guy is carrying is supposed to be the shape of the Sydney Opera House, which I think is also a really nice nod to the place and feels like connected in a really clear visual way, even if you don't immediately make the connection. What I do really like about this mark is that it's one of the first times that you see the type treatment actually being connected to the mark. It's not just a font that they've typed out, someone really drew this by hand and it feels connected as one mark made by one person. My favorite logos are ones where the mark and the logo type feel really integrated and speaking the same language, and that you can use either version separately and they still feel like the same logo. And I think this does that. They took this graphic as the rings rippling out into the water of the Sydney Harbor, and then took a section of it as this really abstracted shape, and they plastered it everywhere. I think that's actually kind of a clever design idea, and it's definitely very vibey, even though it's not like super represented. These guys are named Sid, Ollie, and Millie for the Sydney Olympics of the Millennium, which is maybe a little on the nose. And they feel very Saturday morning cartoon, so, go for it, I guess. Overall, I do think this feels very of the time, but I think it did the job and they created enough elements that it could be continued out in a lot of ways. So for that, I'm going to put it into like a weak B tier. Now we head to Salt Lake, and the theme is back to it's snowing. The mark is a snowflake. The colors are supposed to represent the Utah landscape. The graphic pattern is supposed to represent the indigenous people of the area. It's fine. It's fine. Their three little mascots are named Powder, Copper, and Coal. They have like full bios and workups and personality briefings behind them. And I don't know, as opposed to some of the other years where the mascots really felt like they had a lot of personality and soul and carried a lot in the games, these guys just feel like they were made in a focus group. And for whatever reason, it just feels a little soulless to me, which is kind of how I feel about the whole thing. I will say I think that their Olympic cauldron as this like big ice crystal is really beautiful, but otherwise, like, there's just not a lot going on. There's not really anything that they could use for environmental graphics or things in actual space. So what you get are just like banners with some swashes on them, and that's kind of it. Which means in the way that people are going to experience this brand, looking at a television screen, you're just kind of getting like some energy lines. Anyway, honestly, I had to look up this brand like 3 times in the process of this to remember which one it was, which means I'm putting it all the way down into D tier. And now we're in Athens, which is all the way on the other end of the spectrum. I very much remember this brand. The mark itself is a really interesting case, because obviously this is the first time we're getting like actual texture. I love this really handmade watercolor brush texture, and choosing to make that the actual mark was pretty gutsy. I'm not even sure I would do that now, but it feels really expressive. And I love this hand-drawn laurel wreath that's meant to represent the original Olympic Games that they would crown the winners with. It feels really connected to the place. It makes a lot of sense. It's a really striking mark. The only thing that jars me is you have this really handmade, textural, expressive mark and the most boring type treatment known to man. Why they couldn't have just drawn Athens in the same handwriting as that laurel wreath, I do not know. So it kind of takes it down a little bit for me. But I love that they took the very real inspiration of the actual ruins of the original game sites and used those mosaics and patterns and graphics to create these kind of patchwork mosaic quilts, and then use all of those patterning in a bunch of different ways across the events. I think it's really smart. The cobalt blue makes a ton of sense for Greece. The expanded colors feel very natural to the place. Yeah, it feels very early 2000s, but it makes a lot of sense. And it means that you have all of these patterns that you can do a lot of things with. So every stadium and podium and signage piece has a different version of these patterns. No two are the same, but they all feel connected, which I really like. They even made their pictogram series representing broken shards of Greek pottery. So it looks like the opening sequence of Hercules, and I really love it. It's a step beyond what they needed to do, but it feels really consistent with the rest of what they have going on. These strange little guys are named Phevos and Athena. At first glance, they're super weird, but when you actually dig into it, they took their exact shape from a piece of pottery that they think was an original toy in ancient Greece, which I actually think is a super clever idea. Yeah, they're weird, but they've got a lot of expression and character, and they feel really authentic. I love how much time and care they put into these individual illustrations of them doing all of the sports. They feel like really cool graphics themselves. And ultimately, this doesn't feel like it was made in a lab to sell merch to children. And you can really see how one team of designers could have made both of those things. They feel connected and cohesive to the whole thing. So this is another case where, yeah, it feels very of the time, but I think they did a good job. It feels super connected to the place. They've got a ton of options for how you can use all of these graphic elements, and it's very memorable. So you know what? A-marks. All right, this has already been a while. The sun is down. I've been yapping to y'all for a hot minute. I'm gonna pause here and I'll pick it back up tomorrow. Okay, new day, new cup of coffee, and we're gonna dive back in and head over to Italy for Torino in 2006. And honestly, I feel a little divided on this one. First off, we gotta talk about this logo. So the idea here is it is supposed to represent the Mole Antonelliana, which is a big landmark in the city of Turin. This one just screams design by committee to me. While I was obviously not in their design meeting in the early 2000s coming up with this mark, here's my reenactment of how I think it went. We have this beautiful building that represents the city. We want to show the spires of this tower coming together to feel like Olympic might. And then someone said, hey, we're also in the Alps. Let's have it also represent a mountain coming up into the sky. And then someone else said, hey, this is the Winter Olympics. It should be snowflakes. And then someone else said, hey, let's represent modern technology. Make the snowflakes feel like a web, so we're showing how connected we are in the modern era. And that is how you end up with this mid-2000s racing game logo. Something I haven't covered yet is that every time a city submits themselves for consideration to be chosen as the Olympic venue, they have to put together a full package of what the games would look like and where they would host them and what their plans are. And that package includes a provisional logo. It's never going to be the final brand because obviously they haven't been chosen yet. A lot more work is going to go into it if they are, but they make a provisional logo as a placeholder to say, hey, this is our bid, this is what the city would look like. And in a lot of these more modern boards, I'm also including what this submitted temporary logo was for the city, because I think it's really interesting to see what their first initial idea was and then how that changed when it was actually expanded out in the final brand. Sometimes they're somewhat similar, but often they're like pretty far away from what the original idea was. And that idea is the one thing that the board was looking at when they made the decision. Obviously, they're not choosing the city based on the brand that they came up with, but I do think that it kind of sways, here's the general idea that we have for the games. So when you submit a logo that has kind of one feel to it, and then you end up with something very different, it can be a little bit jarring. And that's the case here. The candidate city logo that they submitted also had that idea of representing the spire of their most famous building, but in a way that was a little bit more graphic and maybe a little bit more timeless, felt a little bit more maybe Italian. The logo type was in a serif that felt a little bit more dignified. And overall, I think this mark is actually pretty cool. It's pretty modern and graphic. It reminds me a little bit of the original Mexico logo, of how these lines could then end up becoming more patterns and getting extended out. I could already see how you could do a lot of things with this mark, even though it still feels a little bit more traditional and maybe a little more connected to northern Italy, at least for me. I think it's interesting to see how this original main idea of we want to show the spire of our building is still there in the final product, but what they ended up doing with it just went through all of these different add-ons in a way that I don't think was totally helpful. So suffice to say, I don't love this logo. And then I think when you see how they extended it, it just feels like you have 2, maybe 3 different teams working on this, and none of them talk to each other. As we get into the more modern era, each brand also included a video showcasing the brand and unveiling what their logo and their kind of concept was. So we can see a little bit more motion and maybe more what people had in mind for how these images and graphics would be used in context. Certainly more than we did in some of the older games. So the idea here was to reference classic Italian architecture with all of these columns and arches and plazas lines and make those shapes kind of exploding out into dynamic energy. Okay, that's a decent idea. The overall color palette here is very early 2000s, and while in Sydney that made a lot of sense for the city, I can't figure out what this really bright neon color palette connects to in northern Italy. But, it's a choice and it's there. I like the idea of having these arches and columns. I think that at least connects to Italy to me and feels like a nice interpretation of it. But it gets a little bit limited in how you then express it, because there's not a whole lot there that you can then expand out into different events and signage on different things. What you end up with is my next Olympic design pet peeve, which is whooshing energy as our main design. These are athletes, there's motion. I know, let's just do some energy. And that's the design concept. I know there's more to it here, but that's kind of what this ends up reducing down to. And I just feel like it loses a lot of meaning and certainly connection to where we actually are. At first glance, this collection of posters seems to be kind of in keeping with the main design, except it's actually kind of a totally different color palette. And these swooshing energy lines have totally different patterns and elements to them that don't show up anywhere else in the brand. It's like they were made by totally different people that were like talking in the next room. And when you translate these things out to the environmental graphics and uniforms and signage, all you kind of end up with are some colorful swooshing lines that could literally be not just of any Olympic Games, but like any conference in the mid-2000s. And that totally loses the point of what this stuff is supposed to do. There's nothing that connects it to this cohesive story, and that's a real bummer. And that's not really the fault of one particular person. If you gave me this design package and said, hey, design me a trash can, I would have a very hard time doing that and not just adding some like swooshy blue lines and calling it a day, because there's just not a whole lot else to play with. And then we pull in the Turin mascots, who are Neve and Gliese, the snowball and ice cube. Hey, did you know this was the Winter Olympics? And I don't actually hate them. They're kind of charming, but also they feel like they are from a completely different event. There's no color palette connection. The line work is totally different. The vibe of them is a completely different style than all of the other graphics. Again, it just feels like the work of a completely different group that wasn't even working in the same building as everyone else. I can't even really find a consistent set of graphics or typography that's used from one element to the other. Things haven't felt this disjointed since we're like Grenoble back in the 60s. Like, you cannot tell me that this primary poster does not look like it's advertising like a Formula One race. It doesn't even look like the Olympics. And then you have completely different type systems on every other piece of literature. Like, was there a typeface for this? I don't even know. So yeah, all in all, ugh. But now we're going to jump light years into the design future with Beijing in 2008. And I gotta tell you, I love this one. First, we have to talk about this mark. And this has so many of the elements that I love in a good Olympic design. First, it's simple enough to be scalable, to be transferable onto different materials. You can embroider it onto a hat, but it is full of character. In this case, literally, because it is actually designed to reference the Chinese character for the city of Beijing. But they've changed the character enough to represent an athlete in motion, but it still feels like a Chinese character. It's flat and can be reproduced digitally, but it feels really textural and handmade. Instead of the Barcelona logo that had this really digital roughing, this one feels like it was actually inked by hand and then scanned in. It connects to sport, it connects to the city, it feels really connected to a culture, but it's easy to reproduce and scale. Perfect. And they actually included the typography into the idea of the logo. I think if I were making this typeface, it would feel a little bit stereotypical and kind of inappropriate, but in this context, it works beautifully and it feels really authentic because it feels like a true representation of a very ancient art form. This is a calligraphic script made by hand. Each of these letters was clearly made individually. It wasn't just copy and pasted from a font. And it feels completely connected to the mark. You could use either one individually or together in any combination, and they all feel like a cohesive logo suite, which is just really great. These games also put a huge amount of emphasis on the mascot, or I should say the mascots. And the process of creating them and then introducing them was kind of a whole thing. Obviously, this is the largest set of mascots that we've gotten, but what I love about them is that it really feels like they were designed by the same people. The inking style of these characters feels really connected to the inking style of that logo type because they're referencing the same art form. I know these guys were a little bit contentious, but personally, I really like them. They're really intricate, they're really characterful, they feel like they have tons of personality, And they spent a lot of time really expanding these guys. They had a whole cartoon run. They made merch. They made stuffies. They made whole interactive shows with the live action versions of the walk around costumes. They became really a part of the identity of these games, but also of Chinese identity in general. I lived in Beijing for a bit years later, and I saw costume versions of these guys walking around the city all of the time. They became really beloved parts of the city culture in a way that is really successful. I just love how they took this pretty simple idea of a Chinese brush and used that same thing to expand out in a lot of different ways. It doesn't feel like they're just trying to throw some lines up. It feels really researched and considered and connective to the history of the place. Every pattern was taken from actual ancient references. So when you walk around the city and go to palaces and temples, you're going to see a lot of the same imagery that then you saw on the signage around them, which is really beautiful. They expanded this idea to their pictogram set. So for each sport, you had an illustration that referenced the character for that type. And overall, I just think it feels really cohesive. That idea can carry over into physical buildings and architecture, also giant graphics, but also into posters and smaller pieces. And everything kind of feels very easy to replicate. If you asked me to design a trash can to fit in this event, I could do that no problem, because I already know what elements I would pull from. I also just feel like there were some really specific design decisions that really felt thoughtful to the place. When they were designing the Olympic medal for these games, they wanted to incorporate a material that felt specifically Chinese. So they landed on jade because it represents good luck and good fortune and feels really connected to their story. But jade is really fragile. So they spent months and made hundreds of different prototypes of how they could embed jade into the medal without it breaking when the athletes bit down on their medals. And they kept going until they finally found a really secure way to encase it. I just think that's really beautiful. It's a small detail that very few people would notice, but it adds to the real specificity of this thing. All in all, I just love this one. Keep that in mind when we come back to Beijing as a spoiler. And then we head to Vancouver 2010, and the good times just keep on rolling. This is a great example of how all of the design principles that I loved about the Beijing games can be expressed in a completely different place with totally different references. No two games could look farther apart from each other, but they're doing a lot of the same things really well. This design was made by a pretty small team of pretty young designers, and their main goal was that they wanted to show that Canada was more than red maple leaves. How do we introduce the idea of Vancouver and Canada in general to the international stage, but maybe moving away from the red plaid, lumberjack, we drink maple syrup all of the time kind of associations? It still needs to feel really connected to the spirit of Canada, but maybe outside of some of those traditional, automatic associations. And I think that's a really interesting challenge. So they set a really natural color palette of greens and blues, but they have a lot of variations within that to give a lot of texture. And then they clearly spent a lot of time in Vancouver. The logo itself is a stylized version of an Inishuk, which are stacked stone statues that are made by Inuit people as communication tools. And this one is actually the shape of the symbol for friend, which is really a cool message. I love this idea as a mark because, again, it's simple shapes, it's easy to scale and to use in different ways, but it feels really expressive and it has a lot of connection to the place. The only problem I have with this specific mark is I don't get why we added in the red and yellow when we didn't use them anywhere else in the brand. I wish they had just kept the same green and blue color scheme that they have for everything else and just made this all tones of the same thing. And to continue being a broken drum, I wish they had made the logo type actually connect to the mark and have a little bit more expression, because on its own, it's just completely boring. But other than that, I am totally into this. What I love is that while this mark makes a lot of sense to the larger story, it's not the only thing going on graphically. They use the idea of a Canadian maple leaf as one of their primary images, but they added in all of this texture and pattern in a way that could be expanded in a lot of different ways. They clearly spent a lot of time in Vancouver, and they created these graphics that had, some swirls and whooshes, but instead of it feeling like just general energy, it's the waves and the mountains in the place that you're in. And then they added in some specific references and landmarks that connected to the place, but in a way that feels really subtle. Like you can spend some time digging through and finding things you can connect to, or you can just kind of get like the generic vibe of this at a quick glance. This definitely feels a little mid-2000s as a design style, but every decision feels really intentional to the place, and they all feel like they were made very much by the same team. I love that there's enough in these graphics that you can really easily translate them to all kinds of things without just repeating the same shapes over and over again. They look great on giant signage or in big environmental graphics on a ski slope, but I could also easily translate this to a trash can. In this case, I can see exactly what that trash can would look like. There's not a single logo on this, and yet I know exactly where they are because they've created enough graphics that everything feels connected. This Olympic cauldron with these giant shards of ice is so stunning, and it feels totally in line with everything else. They also made one of my favorite little sets of mascots. I just think these guys are adorable. This is Quachi and Miga, the Sasquatch and Sea Bear. I think that makes this the official first cryptid of the games. And they have a whole little extended cast of friends that they hang out with. I spent a minute trying to figure out why these little cartoon characters feel so much more authentic than some of the other ones we've seen recently in that very like mid-2000s Disney DreamWorks kind of vibe. And I think it's because, again, they feel really love the place. These were clearly handmade, lovingly drawn. I just want to hang out with this Sasquatch. Look at him curling. I mean, don't you just think they're having so much fun? I would buy merch with this little guy on it. Not because I was told to by a focus group, but because they genuinely feel fun. And I love the way they naturally incorporated them into a lot of the graphics of the brand, not just the things that were designed for kids. You can see them playing around on the Zambonis that cleared the ice. They're imprinted on the tickets to different events. And I feel like, again, it just feels really cohesive. I went to Vancouver a couple of years ago, and I was surprised to see how many of these graphics from 2010 I still saw plastered all over the city or in murals or in store windows. People still use this as a representation of the city itself, not just of those specific games. And I think that's really a testament to when a team manages to represent the place in a way that feels really connected and long-lasting. Pretty cool. All right, now the moment you might have been waiting for, let's talk about London. So this is the provisional logo that they submitted when they were a candidate city. And this is the brand that they came up with. And yeah, this brand is a lot. But I will say, it is 2026. And if you asked me to envision an Olympic game in my brain, this one would come to my mind immediately, almost 15 years later. And honestly, that's not nothing. So this was designed by Wolf Owens, which is one of the most famous and prestigious design firms in the world. And their goal was that they didn't want to incorporate a lot of traditional London landmarks and references. They really wanted to find a way to represent modern technological London. And specifically, they wanted to connect to the youth. So I think they really locked in on this idea that it needed to be really fun and really bright and very young. Very much different than what you might associate with, London. This is the first logo that only focused on the year itself without any other iconography or graphic. And their stated goal was that the jagged design was to represent modern London. So to say this was contentious when it came out is an understatement. There was a petition with 46,000 signatures on it from Londoners to make a different design to represent their city. A lot of backlash happened around this design. This also falls prey to a problem that a lot of abstract logo designs have, which is that it didn't pass what I've invented as the 13-year-old boy test. This is supposed to be this abstract expression of modern jagged London, but anytime you have abstract shapes put together, sometimes people see a lot of things in them, and people saw a lot of things in this. Some people said it looked like a swastika. Some people said it looked like some cartoon characters doing some stuff. Whatever. A lot of people had opinions because when you don't have anything else to focus on, your brain just kind of fills in the gaps with whatever you have references for. On a technical level, I actually like the way that they were able to fit the Olympic rings into the O. I actually think that's a really nice part. But I wish that the London was able to be under the 2012 so that it could actually be of equal billing and have a little bit more visual weight. I also just think that the separate diamond that I think is supposed to be a part of the two ends up just reading as this weird middle figure that isn't part of anything, and I don't really get why that was there. I also think that beyond the main mark, there just weren't enough graphics and elements to really expand out and do a lot of things with. So they took the idea of these jagged edges and extended them out to be these grid lines that then showed up in a lot of different elements. They used them to construct actual signage in buildings, which I actually think is kind of cool looking and weird. But when you put them on print, it ends up just kind of looking like any generic 2000s Olympics kind of gritty, blocky thing. They were also the first games to make 2 different sets of pictograms, one that was more literal and informational to be used on actual signage, and the other that were these extensions of this jagged, gritty thing to feel more evocative of the energy of the games, which I actually think turned out pretty cool. So they could use those on tickets and signage to express the different events, and I like that. They also went the extra mile and designed a full London typeface that could be used for headlines and signage throughout the games, which I wish more design systems used. It's a really natural way to extend the brand in a way that you need to have anyway, and I really like that they did that. All right, I'm kind of procrastinating to prolong needing to talk about these guys. These are Wenlock and Mandeville. And the lore is that they were created from the last drop of molten steel used to make the Olympic Stadium. They were fully metallic, they had Olympic rings as bangles, and their little tiaras were meant to be London black caps. It's kind of a toss-up whether the Atlanta Izzy or these guys are more terrifying. That's a fun race. Also, the walk-around versions of these are just going to haunt my dream. But you know what? They fully went for it. So yeah, a lot of people consider this to be the worst design in Olympic history. But personally, in my own metric, I think it's worse to have something that's forgettable than something that's a little bit divisive. It's not exactly my cup of tea, but I appreciate that they had a strong direction and they just leaned all in and really went for it. And that's about all I can say. It is worth noting that when I was originally going back and researching these, I vividly remembered the London Games, but in my head, they took place in like 2000, 2002, because the logo and the brand felt so millennial. I was pretty shocked when I discovered that it took place in 2012, after I had already graduated art school. So, all in all, this really feels like a time capsule, but I'm not sure where it is a time capsule to. And then we head to Sochi in 2014. And this is a brand that really surprised me the more time I spent with it. I remember at the time being wildly underwhelmed by the logo, mainly because I don't get the .ru thing. The fact that it feels like a URL was not an accident. In 2014, social media was becoming a much bigger part of the cultural landscape, and people were excited about the idea that these games would be viewed more and shared more on those social platforms than ever before. And so they chose to make a fully typographic logo that was literally the name of the URL that you would type in for the games, which in itself is a choice. So is the phrase hot, cool, yours. Not my favorite tagline, but it's a take. I actually really do like the way that the characters in the 2 lines interact with each other. The H and I into the 14 is actually a really nice solution, and I like the way those interact. Overall, though, it's pretty underwhelming as a logo mark, and that's pretty much what I remembered about all of the games. But what made me change my mind was when I started looking at what they did for the rest of the brand. Outside of the main mark, they gathered together a pool of a ton of different reference images of Russian textiles and embroidery and quilts. And then from those, they created a whole pool of graphics and patterns that could be overlaid together and interlock into all of these different quilt patterns. They created a really specific set of rules and guidelines for how they would interact with each other, how they would be used, what colors would overlay, and then they used them in a bunch of different ways. As full quilts and big giant environmental graphics that you saw behind all of the sports. And then cut into shapes like the pictograms of all of the different athletes. But they also used it inside the totally typographic logo. So instead of just this really plain digital logo, you also had a version where they overlaid literal quilted, textured Russian history on top of that digital form, which is kind of a cool concept. And I love how many iterations of all of these different quilted patterns can show up in different spots. It's never going to be exactly the same, but everything feels wildly cohesive, which is a really beautiful, expansive design. These guys didn't even get names, and they're literally hare, polar bear, and leopard, and they're fine. They do the job. It's whatever. I will say this is also one of my very favorite Olympic torches. I think this is a beautiful shape, and look how beautiful it is when they have it glowing. I mean, that is just gorgeous industrial design. Overall, I still think the URL thing was a little bit silly, but I appreciate how much thought went into creating an expansive set of elements that could be remixed in a lot of different ways. So this does the job. And then we come to Rio 2016, which is one of my favorite examples of a brand that so feels like the place before you even spend a lot of time looking at it. At very first glance, you get that this is a vibrant, tropical, fun, joyous city. And as someone who's been to Rio, that is exactly what you're going to find. The logo itself was the first 3D logo in the Olympic Games, and also the first time that they showed multiple athletes together instead of just one, which I think is a really nice idea. And they handmade a logo type to go with it. Each of those elements work great together, they work great individually, and they feel like they were made by the same person. Beautiful. I also love that the swoop of the hands in the logo and the swoop of the R in the type treatment both create this ribbon element that they reference in a lot of other graphics all the way through. Like, look at this graphic that spells out Rio with all of the different sports ball equipment that you use in the games. This is just a really cool graphic. And in addition to the mark itself, which is already cool, they took a page out of Vancouver's playbook and created a whole graphic landscape that could be broken down into a lot of different elements. They made this abstracted shape, but they included a lot of landmarks and topography of the city itself, so that if you really squinted and spent some time with it, you could start to recognize a lot of things that felt very referential of the place, but overall it just created a real vibe. And then they could take these abstracted shapes and use them in a ton of different ways. So you could see how they would show up well in big giant environmental graphics that would look good on the television, but also in printed materials and tickets and merch. They created a toolbox of things that they could pull from to remix in a ton of different ways, which is just the gold standard. And then we have these little guys. Meet Vinicius. He is named after a Brazilian poet and is an amalgamation of a bunch of different Brazilian animals all at once. And the Paralympic mascot is a representation of the rainforest, whose name is Tom. I just love these guys. They feel really expressive and creative. They totally feel connected to the place as well as to the overall branding. Everything feels really cohesive, they're not terrifying, and you want to hang out with them. Look at them dancing and doing all these fun poses. They are not terrifying as walk-around characters, which is very important, and they just look like they're having a lot of fun doing all these little events. It feels like they were made by the same design team, and they made a lot of graphics with them incorporated into the rest of the branding. Not just like, here's a mascot for kids. Here's them on informational signage. Here's them on promotional material. And here's them riding a gondola. One of my favorite use cases for this is that they made them into stuffies that they gave to each of the medalists. So they would get onto the podium, and instead of having flowers, they had a little plushie. There was even a rule in the wrestling competition that the referees had to throw a soft object into the ring to stop the play. And so instead of it being like a handkerchief or something, they tossed one of these stuffed animals into the ring. I mean, this is just great design. All in all, I feel like Rio is still the gold standard for what fun, expressive, joyous design can look like that represents a city and also is just really smart graphically. And then we come to PyeongChang in 2018, and I'm a little bit sad about this one. If you recall way back in this video, I loved the Seoul 88 branding. It's probably my favorite brand of the whole 80s. I think it felt like the city. It felt really connected to the history of Korea in a way that was modern at the time, but also really grounded and referencing a lot of beautiful things about the culture. And I just feel like that's missing here. The mark itself is actually trying to be pretty clever. It's an abstracted version of characters in Hangul that are supposed to reference the syllables of the words PyeongChang and also harmony, snow, ice, and gathering place. So altogether you can get kind of where they were going, but I just don't feel like it actually gets there visually. It kind of just ends up feeling like a Microsoft logo, which is a real shame because I think the ideas behind it are really beautiful. And then pushing out from there just weren't a whole lot of graphic elements developed that could be remixed a lot. So they kind of fell back on, hey look, it's winter, have you heard of snow? Each of the official posters feel completely separate from each other and again, made by totally different people. They made this abstracted pattern, incorporating Korean symbols with snowflakes to make this sort of graphic scatter, which is a cool idea, but again, when you blow it up large, it ends up just kind of reading as generic 2000s design. This little guy is Sohorang, the white tiger, and he's pretty cute, but he's not nearly as specific as Hidori the tiger with his ribbons flowing around as he whirls around in gymnastics. And ultimately, other than using the Korean characters as a graphic pattern, which I think is cool, everything else could have just been applied to any winter game, which is just a real bummer. And now we come to Tokyo, and we've got a lot to talk about here. First, obviously, these are the games that were affected by the 2020 pandemic, and they get a big old pass in my book, but for a lot of the problems that they ran into trying to express these games. So we're going to take everything with a big old grain of salt for that reason. But before we even talk about this brand, we have to go back in time a little bit, because this was not the first design chosen for Tokyo. This is the temporary logo they used as a candidate city, and this is the official brand that they came out with when they created the whole system. Problem is, it was immediately accused of plagiarism by a Belgian designer who created this brand for a theater in 2013. Now here's the thing. I firmly believe that when it comes to design, there is no such thing as a new idea. And I can see how both of these things could have been created in the world at the same time and not have been an exact copy. That said, when they pushed into it a little bit farther, they discovered that there were actually several other allegations of plagiarism by this designer for previous work, and so the committee decided it was not worth it and they were just going to scrap it and start again. So they went back to our good friend, the open design competition. Unlike previous competitions though, instead of just announcing the winner, they actually showed the runners-up as well, so you can see these other brands that they were choosing. Overall, I think these are all pretty and they would have made good brands, but I think that the one that they chose is really interesting and definitely stood very much apart from all of the other things that were on the table. It's definitely a gutsier move and a bigger jump away from your immediate associations when you just think Tokyo, or when you think of those classic 1964 Tokyo graphics. And I respect that they really wanted to take a big swing in a different direction. This checker is a traditional pattern from the Edo period, and by putting it into that rising sun shape, you are connecting to Japan, but in a way that feels really different from everything we've seen before. Overall, I think it's a really cool idea, and I really like how you can extrapolate it out to do some different things. This is that same checker with the pictograms of all the different sports, so you can see how it creates this really cool pattern. I tried really hard to find examples of this being used in situ in the games themselves, and I wish they had used this more because I think it's a really cool graphic. I also love how it can express itself on merchandise and in different mediums, like these really sketchy versions on a poster. These are really beautiful, and I think they feel very Japanese, but in a way that feels very special and set apart from a lot of things that you might immediately associate. They also created this really sophisticated jewel tone color palette inspired by kimono silk dyes. It's definitely a lot deeper and richer than we've seen in any other Olympic Games, and it creates a very elegant, slightly more somber vibe that is a really interesting take. There just weren't as many created things and pieces of merch and signage and stuff created, but you can really see how this gets expressed out. As simple as turning that checkered pattern into a silk scarf, or using the logo as a stamp to highlight the date on a calendar. It's all really clever. I feel like even though they created this full color palette, you really only saw the blue and the red, and I wish they had explored that a bit more. But again, everything feels really cohesive, I think it's really pretty, and I think it's a really elegant portrayal of a game. This lotus flower Olympic cauldron is absolutely beautiful, and I love how even that itself feels like that checkered pattern. It's subtle, but it's really beautiful. This little guy is named Miria Toa, and he was chosen by the most intense design competition I have ever heard of. They gave one vote to every elementary school within Japan and let all of the kids pool their collective votes together to choose a winner, which I think is kind of awesome. Overall, I think this was a really elegant, interesting take on the games. I think they dealt with a lot of hardship and a lot of fast turnarounds and unexpected variables very beautifully, and I think they did a good job. And now we're back in Beijing for 2022, and I'm just pretty torn on this one. If you recall, this was the Beijing 2008 design, and this is the logo for 2022. When you actually watch the motion graphic of this logo being unveiled, it's actually beautifully made by hand, representing the character for the word winter, which is really lovely. The problem is that this ink version and this digitized version feel really far away from each other. I love the expression and texture and character that this character has. But then when you see it actually worked out, I just feel like it loses a lot of that joy and presence. And that's okay, it's a style and I don't have to love it. It can go in a direction. My problem is that I feel like they went into different directions with all of the rest of the design elements for this game. On one hand, a lot of the main posters and signage and graphic elements were these kind of generic, open, flowy, hey look, it's winter kind of visuals. They extrapolated the Chinese mountains and the snow into these kind of whooshy abstracts that read a little bit like a Windows desktop background. And when you blow them up big and put them on signage, all you really get is just blue whooshes that again just don't have a lot of specific character. It could be not only any Olympic Games, but also any tech conference. The main sport posters bring back the energy whooshes into sort of ribbony snow things that just kind of feel Montreal. And then they did a design competition for posters. But instead of just choosing one winner, they picked 11 to be official posters, which, yay representation, but it means that there's no specific design that really represents the brand, and everything feels really scattered. Because it is. But then over here, there was a whole other set of design things that felt a lot more at home with the '08 designs. All of the sport pictograms were these really cool illustrations that look like they were chiseled out of traditional Chinese woodblock prints. And so do these posters. Like, these are rad. They have a ton of character, they feel very connected to the place, but they represent a lot of the things in the Olympic Games. This is a really cool direction. It's just a totally different direction than the rest of what's happening. These environmental graphics are my favorite part of this whole design. I love this fan. I think it is so expressive. It is so beautiful. I love the patterning in it. I think that if they had taken this design and extrapolated that out, it would have ended up being really neat. Not a direct copy of the '08 design, but still really feeling like the place. I just don't really get the whooshy blue thing. I feel like they were two completely different teams. This little guy is Bing Duen Duen, and he is a Chinese panda in a full-body ice suit that is meant to look like an astronaut going into space. I mean, he's kind of adorable. I feel like they could have done more with him. There really weren't a lot of different variations, and he didn't play any sports, but he's really cute. And the Paralympic mascot is a Chinese lantern, who I actually think is adorable. I actually really like these guys. I just feel like, as with the rest of the games, there's a lot more that could have been done if they had just really leaned in on this direction. So I'm just gonna put this one all the way down into what brand? Because I just don't feel like it really got there. On the complete other end of the spectrum, we come to Paris 24, which is arguably the most designed game we've seen thus far. First, we gotta talk about this logo, which definitely raised quite a stir when it came out. The goal was to incorporate 3 different elements: the Olympic gold medal, the Olympic flame, and the Marianne, which is the representation of the French Republic. They were also trying to reference the Art Deco style that you see all over Paris, which, first off, can I just say, I love this type treatment. It's simple, it's clean, but it has so much personality because they're referencing that beautiful Art Deco type in a way that feels really modern. This looks completely at home with the Paris metro signs that are beloved throughout the city, but it feels clean and digital and very easy to read and easy to use. It's such a smart interpretation. I really love it. When you get to the mark itself, I feel like this could be debated forever. Yeah, I get that it's a little bit weird that there's this pair of lips. I think some people have thought it looks like a mustache. I think you could maybe massage the hair a little bit more to do something different with the shape. Ultimately, I think it's a really cool mark. There's something fun in any design when you can play with the negative space to show different things. Yeah, different people are going to have different reactions, but overall, it's a simple execution of a really complicated idea into something that feels really graphic and stylish. So in my brain, it's a successful logo. What I really love, though, is everything else they did with it. If you're picking up on the theme of all of the games I've really liked, they did not just stop at the logo. They created a very expanded set of graphics inspired by the city and then used those in a whole bunch of different ways. Instead of the sprawling landscapes of Rio or Vancouver, they made this really graphic grid of extracted versions of the landmarks through Paris and the sports of the Olympics. All together, they made a lot of different versions that could be broken down kind of infinitely. They also added in this kind of wild Art Deco pastel color palette that I think is what a lot of people were actually reacting to. I think some people were just offended that the Olympics were pink, which is, kind of their problem. What I love is that I feel like this design team really thought about where these graphics were going to go. Because this was going to take place in Paris proper, which is a beautiful city full of very monochromatic buildings that have a lot of architectural detail and filigree. They created these very graphic, blocky, but vibrant graphics that could be blown up onto these very sand-colored buildings and really stand out. I mean, look how beautiful these images are of this really bright branding in the context of Paris. I love the way it looks on scaffolding and on partitions and all of the kind of ugly things that you see as part of a temporary event. They can be sort of endlessly rearranged on banners and in signage and to look really good on a television when you're watching someone swim past and see all of the graphics. It's really smart. They also took a page out of the London playbook and made 2 sets of pictograms. One that was for just representational direction signage, and the other that was really expressive and used to kind of represent each game like a coat of arms in a really graphic style. You end up with some really cool signage and tickets because you've made each one into a very cool actual graphic shape, which is different than I think we've seen in other games. I also adore the official posters for this event. They worked with one Parisian artist who put in over 2,000 hours of manual work to hand illustrate this incredibly intricate, whimsical, overly detailed version of Paris that reads like a Where's Waldo book. It is so beautiful, and there are so many really intricate little Easter eggs and details that you could spend forever looking at. You could blow up any individual little piece of this and make it its own graphic, and I just think it is so extra. It's way more than was necessary, and it is so beautiful. In the world of AI slop, this is so special. I would love to buy this poster and hang it on my wall, because I just think it's really cool work, and it's way more than they needed to do. Finally, we gotta talk about these little guys, who are called the Furges, to represent the Phrygian cap, which is the symbol of French independence. This is a take on a mascot, and honestly, they're quite fun. They feel like little minions, they've got a lot of character, they pile on top of each other in weird poses, and I like them. I just wish that they had been able to integrate them a little bit better with the rest of the design that has happened. I know they had to go with red because of the red cap thing, but maybe they could have worked that red into the rest of the brand, or in some way connected them with some extra color so they didn't feel so completely disparate from everything else that has this really stylized palette happening. Other than that, they're a ton of fun. It's really weird. It's a really cool interpretation. Style points. All said, I know that not everyone loved this, but this hits every pillar for me. It's completely specific to the place, it's extremely scalable and can be used in a million different ways, and for me at least, this is deeply memorable. So it is going way at the top of my list. If you are still with me, congratulations, we made it to Milano Cortina. Let's actually look at what's going on this year, because maybe you haven't seen this brand yet. So these games take place throughout the Milano region, and are the 70th anniversary of the first time that Cortina hosted the games back in 1956, which is pretty cool. The actual mark is supposed to be the act of someone drawing 26 on a frosty window, which is actually a cool idea. It looks way cooler in a motion graphic, and I don't think that you would actually get that if you just, looked at it. But overall, I think it's kind of neat. Even if you didn't have that association, you could probably get snow track or some sort of jump or something like that. So even though it's a little bit abstracted for where it's going, I think you get the general idea. They're also leaning fully into the fact that it's mostly going to be viewed digitally, and they added a lot of digital dimension in a way that I actually think is pretty cool. I appreciate that even in a very minimal type treatment, they customized it. So it actually feels really expressive. It feels like someone skiing on a mountain towards the logo, which I think is really nice. The Paralympic version is supposed to reference the Northern Lights, which you can apparently see throughout the region, which is a nice little detail also. And overall, I think this is nice. It definitely gets into our whole brand is energy swoops territory, which they're kind of doing unabashedly. If you look on their website and the video for the logo unveiling, the whole idea is feel the vibe. So it's just trying to represent the vibe and energy of the Milano region, and they're doing the literal shoo 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 thing to be oh, this is the creativity of glass blowing and pizza throwing and skiing, and I will say that for that idea, I think this is a nice execution. They've added this textural gradient, which is very kind of on trend right now, and I like that they've added enough elements that I do think you can use this in a lot of ways. They've really extended the color palette, and they've made a lot of really specific shapes that get reused over and over again. I don't think that anyone is ever going to look at this shape and say, yes, obviously that is Venetian glass blowing. But I do think that it's nice to see those things repeated. Overall, it has a very art school-y vibe to it, where you have to really hear a lot of explanations behind the thought process to get any meaning out of it, but I appreciate that they at least thought about it. I think you really do feel the vibe. It feels very Northern Italian, it feels kind of Alpine, but in a kind of cool girl way, and I think that's neat. We already have a lot of images and renderings of a lot of the graphics that are going to be in the events, and also some of the interior spaces, and everything feels pretty cohesive. There's nothing blow your mind, but it's pretty vibey. And they've been really consistent about taking this glowing line and creating the pictograms of the different sports and representing all of the venues in ways that I think are cool. I also give them bonus points for creating their own typeface in a way that I think, especially with something this minimal and abstracted, it kind of needs to carry a lot of the character of the brand. And I appreciate that they actually made something that has some sort of spunk to it. These little guys are Tina and Milo, who are a brother and sister pair of stoats who have their own little gang of snowdrop people called the Flow. Overall, they feel like really nostalgic, slightly 90s cartoon characters in a way that, again, feels like it actually has a lot of character. They feel like real things that are really cute. Anytime I see one of these little characters holding a gun, it completely freaks me out. But watching this little guy curling is great. Overall, I think this does a nice job. I like a lot of these supplemental posters that they've made. I think they feel like kind of vintage travel posters in a way that's really cool. And yeah, I like it. I don't think it's wildly memorable, and it'll be interesting to see how it actually gets developed when we watch the Olympic Games. But yeah, it's nice. Good job. So there we have it, the entire marathon of every Olympic brand to date. I almost included the LA28 brand in this lineup because we actually already have quite a lot of graphics for it, but I feel like that wouldn't really be fair because they're clearly putting a ton of work into all of these designs, and I really want to see what they end up doing with them. So it felt a little bit premature to put that in now, but in the future I will absolutely come back and gush about it because I think it's already shaping up to be a really cool design. If you are still with me, thank you. I would love to hear which is your favorite one. Did I have any takes that you think were wildly off base? And if you enjoyed this level of super in-depth design nerdery, let me know what else you want me to do a super intense deep dive on. I will happily dive into any other strange subculture branding moments and give it my best shot. If you've got a great idea, I would love to hear it. And in the meantime, check out my other Design in the Wild videos here.